Coming up next on Global Perspectives, I'll be talking with Ann Autry from our Interpretation and Translation Office. Please stay tuned. Welcome to Global Perspectives. I'm Karen McDonough, your host, and today I'm talking with my colleague Ann Autry from Anne Arundel County Public Schools, Office of Interpretation and Translation. Welcome, Ann. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Great.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. I know we're going to talk about our Interpretation and Translation Office, what you do, and maybe more importantly, what you don't do, so that our viewers understand the purpose of this office in our system. But I always like to ask our guests a little bit about themselves, how they started with Anne Arundel County Public Schools. So tell me, how has your career with AACPS been?
Well, I've been a temp for a really long time.
Okay.
I started out as a substitute lunch recess monitor
Okay. At what school?
at Bodkin Elementary.
Okay. Very well.
And then I moved along to substituting. Then I was a TSA.
Okay.
And then further on to being an interpreter for our deaf students in our system.
Okay.
And then secretary, and then a principal secretary. And now I'm here.
All right, well, welcome. So you mentioned that you were an interpreter for ASL students. So obviously, is it proper to say you speak sign language, or how do you?
I sign.
You sign. Okay, so you sign. And with your abilities as an ASL interpreter, obviously, you understand a lot about what goes on into interpreting in general and the kind of services that we are able to provide our families and our staff. In the languages that we provide in our system, tell me a little bit about what are some of the languages, how many do we have, and how does the system determine how we pick interpreters of different languages?
Okay, so within the system, when you make a request through Fluency, obviously you already have, you already have a basis of what language you're looking for because you know what family is coming in for that service. So at that point, you would choose, there's a drop down for the languages, and then there's a bank of interpreters that would come up for that particular language if we have an interpreter for that language. Currently in our school system, we have about 80 different languages that are utilized. And that also covers ASL.
Okay, and so those are the languages that our families speak.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
And the interpreters that we have that are AACPS temporary employees or like contracted employees, how many languages do they cover? How many languages do we offer from our interpreters?
About 10
Okay.
of those languages. So be Spanish, Portuguese, ASL, German, Urdu, Arabic, French, Vietnamese, Chinese, and Korean.
And out of those, obviously, I would imagine Spanish is the largest number of requests that we get. You mentioned earlier about the Fluency system, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But how does someone become an interpreter for AACPS? If you speak another language, what should be some of the steps that you would take?
Well, if you speak another language and you're fully bilingual, and hopefully English is one of those languages that benefits us the most, we actually put a job posting out there for it's a temporary interpreter foreign language, and that encompasses all of the languages that we use.
Okay, so there's not a separate job posting for one language or another. It's just a general interpreter
Correct.
job posting. And about how often do we post those kind of jobs?
About once a year.
Okay.
And we just wrapped that up in the end of November with an open job, and we are in the process of getting those new interpreters trained, which will happen in March.
Okay. So you apply to become an interpreter, and you go through the process, and you are selected to be an interpreter for AACPS. What are some of the things that interpreters are then required to do? Is there some sort of training?
There's a full day training for our new interpreters, and anyone who has been in our system that maybe needs a refresher, they can actually attend that. It's full day. It goes over scenarios, it goes over the code of ethics. There's a whole process that we go through with them.
Okay. And I understand that some of the interpreters that we have have the skill of what we call simultaneous interpretation versus consecutive interpretation. Can you tell me a little bit about how those two things are different?
So consecutive would be they're going to listen to what's being said to them, and then they would put that out in the language that was needed. Now, for simultaneous, it would be where you would have multiple interpreters, and it would be instantly said. It may even almost seem like it's scripted because it's so fluid.
So simultaneous is as somebody is talking, then they're just saying what is being said, and then obviously the responses, they're
Correct.
interpreting that as well. I think one of the other terms that we sometimes assume that people know the difference between interpretation and translation. So can you tell us what is interpretation and what is translation?
Yes, I hear this all the time. So when you're interpreting, it is spoken or signed. When you're translating, it's written. So it will always be written for a translation.
Perfect. And are our interpreters also translators, or are those two separate jobs?
Sometimes.
Okay.
It just depends. We do have a team of translators that do both.
Okay.
So.
And so when somebody is assigned to go to a school to be an interpreter, they're assigned to be an interpreter. They're not then also being a translator.
Correct. There's also some instances with our BFs, our bilingual facilitators, where they will do translations for the school. Okay. Especially if it's school-based.
Okay, very good. So we talked about Fluency, and that is a system that I understand AACPS staff have access to. Tell me a little bit about how that system functions. If you want to use a Fluency system, what do you have to do?
So for anyone who wants to use Fluency, you actually have to watch a short training. It gives you the ins and outs of using the system, and then you send us some information that's required, and we set you up in the system. Then you're a requester for your location. Okay. Then at that time, you can request for any language. Doesn't matter what it is, what the time of day of the job is. You just go ahead and put those requests in the system, and we fill those accordingly.
And what would be some appropriate types of requests for an interpreter through Fluency? What kinds of things could AACPS staff ask for an interpreter to do at their school?
So with our office, we solely do for our parents and families. So we're not actually doing requests for students. So in that, it could be a PTA meeting. It could be a function that happens like I don't want to call it a sweetheart dance, but like we've had some where they're doing events that are related to Valentine's Day. So they're having maybe a breakfast or whatever, and they would come and interpret those events, as well as it could be parent-teacher conferences.
Okay. And I understand that sometimes even if there's a discipline meeting or something having to do, because we're there to provide the service to the parent.
Correct.
Okay. Very good. With the Fluency system, is that something where you ask for an interpreter now and you'll have an interpreter in your building in 2 hours? Or what do we like to have requesters do in order to get an interpreter in their building?
We prefer as much notice as possible. We do ask with some of the rare languages, we ask for a little bit more lead time solely because sometimes it's harder to secure that interpreter. But for the most part, I would say 7 days is a good timeline for a request. Okay. Now, if you're doing ASL or Ukrainian or another language, we do ask for a little more of a heads up. And also you can email us and let us know that you've requested that and that that you have the need. That way we can focus on it.
Okay. So that would be for more of those rare languages that are not so common.
Correct.
Because I think you mentioned that we have 10 languages represented in our bank of interpreters, but we have, was it around 80 languages represented in the system?
Yeah.
So what happens if somebody puts in a request on Fluency for one of those languages that we don't have current staff for?
So we outsource those. Okay. We have an agency that we use for the spoken languages. It's called Ad Astra. Okay. And we request for whatever language is requested. We ask and it could be virtual, it could be in person. A lot of times if you get a really, really rare language, virtual is a better option. Okay. Because we have a harder time getting them physically into the buildings.
And that what you said just also occurred to me that our interpreters do have the ability of not if a school person or a staff person needs that assistance not to be provided in person because maybe the parent is also at home, right, and the staff person is in the school building, the interpreter can also be virtual, and that's something that we have the flexibility of doing. With the fluency requests that we want extra time for, and then if we don't have that person or that language covered, then we have outsourced. Is there a kind of a procedure for if somebody has put in a job in fluency and they've seen that job doesn't get picked up? What would you suggest a staff person do? Would they
It's
email?
tough. Sometimes we get phone calls, sometimes we get emails, and also the system isn't perfect. So with fluency, another thing that has occurred recently is, say something happens with that interpreter and they have to drop the job. There's no notification of that either.
Right.
So,
and I guess that's what I want our viewers to know is that because our interpreters are contractors, we sometimes can't control what might happen if somebody doesn't show up. But you are the name and the face behind interpreter at AACPS.
Yes.
So our viewers who happen to be staff and have access to that fluency, because I guess I should also be clear that fluency system is available for school staff to use. The other service that our system provides that I know you're intimately acquainted with is our Language Link system.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about Language Link and how it functions, and maybe what are some of the other uses that it can be used for.
Language Link is a wonderful service. When I was working in the school, I had a parent that actually came in at one point that spoke another language, and what I did in person was, I was like, I can't get an interpreter here right away. I asked him to wait just a second. I asked him to point to the language on the sign, because every school has a sign with all the languages on it. I then figured out the language based on what she pointed at, and I called Language Link, and I gave him our code, asked for the language, and I literally passed the phone back and forth between the two of us. So you don't have to have the person on the phone. They can physically be in front of you too.
Okay. And again, Language Link is one of those that the service is there for our staff to use to help them facilitate with the parents. So it's not a number that parents have access to, but any staff person, from a front office staff, maybe a
classroom teacher,
a school nurse, those kinds of things. I think one of the things that we do also say that Language Link is not appropriate for things that might be of a sensitive nature.
Correct.
Right.
I do agree with that.
And so that way a school can reach out to if they want an interpreter in person for something, or if their bilingual facilitator can cover that, because correct me if I'm wrong, but our bilingual facilitators, we have Spanish, Chinese, Korean. We have the ability to cover French, Portuguese, and German.
Yes.
I believe so.
Yeah,
yes.
I think you've covered them all.
Yeah, okay. Very good. And so that is something that our staff can reach out to their schools, to be able to access that person, and if not, use Language Link for an informational piece for serving the parents. Tell us a little bit about the translations. If a school needs something translated, what are some of the processes that they should go through to get that happen?
So with translations, there's a kind of a gray area in there. So things that are school-based, so it's solely based for that particular school, they typically should go through their bilingual facilitator.
Okay.
When it's something that is county-wide, like a permission slip that would be like our AACPS permission slip, that would be something we would translate. Okay. If it's a curriculum item, it would be translated by us.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of some other things that we've done recently.
But if a school comes across something that is a county document that is used by all schools, and they realize, because maybe nobody's ever needed it in another language before, they should send an email to
interpreter at AACPS.
Okay, and then attach
the document, or attach a link to the document so we can locate it. And then in some cases there may be a translation of that particular document out there, they just might not have known where to find it.
Ah, okay.
So we have a translation site as well that we can search for
Okay.
those.
And then once that document is translated, then it lives in our system so people can have access to it.
Correct.
And then you talked about a school-specific document, obviously maybe like a flyer for an event or some sort of other information that is just particular to that school.
Correct.
What should a school do when they need a translation for that particular item?
They should really ask their bilingual facilitator first.
Okay.
If it is something that is way too large, well, then they should check with their supervisor and see what they wanted, what the next steps would be. And sometimes there have been some very rare occasions something like that has come through because it ends up that we can make it a countywide document. Maybe pull certain things out of it to make it a countywide document.
And then obviously with our bilingual facilitators only covering just those few languages, if it's something that a school has a large enough population for maybe Urdu or Vietnamese where we don't have a bilingual facilitator that covers that, then we obviously would then need to have it translated via a bank of translators. In terms of the bilingual facilitators, are they part of your department? Are they separate?
So they're not really with us, but it's part of school and family partnerships. So we kind of are together, but we're not really together.
Right, and I was going to say full disclosure. So as a supervisor of the
Yes.
bilingual facilitators, they are part of my team. But I know that we try to, as often as possible, when there is an interpretation need, to give that personal service with one of our employees. One of the things we talked briefly about, but I want you to tell us a little bit more about, because I think it's so interesting. Your desire to become an ASL interpreter, and how does that happen? Obviously, you don't need to speak a foreign language to speak ASL, but ASL is its own separate language.
Correct.
So, what got you interested in being an ASL interpreter?
So I had a deaf aunt. She was actually my great aunt, and it's very typical in families when there's a deaf individual in the family that no one in the family signs, not even a parent,
Wow.
siblings, typically not unless they're deaf.
Okay.
And yes, deafness does run in families, but in mine it doesn't.
Okay.
So I, at about the age 12 or 13, I would beg her to teach me one sign at a time.
Oh.
So I was like, okay, what can I learn this time? What can I learn? What can I learn?
Yeah.
So then as that passion grew with learning 1-2 signs here and there, because she lived across the street from my grandmother,
Okay.
I decided that when I was going to learn, I needed a foreign language in high school. They didn't offer it
Okay.
because it was way back when. Thank God they offer it now.
Yeah.
I ended up going to college and taking one of the first classes at Anne Arundel Community College. Yeah, I'm dating myself. It was the first ASL class they offered.
Okay.
And then we begged for a second. And then I ended up going to Catonsville and learning the language in their interpreter prep program.
And Catonsville is
They've changed their name. It was Catonsville Community College, and now
Okay.
is it CCBC, Community College of Baltimore County, I think is what it is. They changed their name. It's been a minute.
so is it a course to learn ASL? But that does not automatically make you an ASL interpreter, right? That means
It
you can
gives you the
speak the
tools.
language.
It gives you the tools to become an interpreter.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that you would necessarily be, that might not be really where you want to land. There are some other schools that offer programs as well, but they offer, it's a certificate. I think they now offer an associate's.
Okay.
When I went, it was only a certificate.
Okay.
And then I left there and had deaf coworkers.
Okay. So I just caught myself because I said, well, you speak sign language, but you don't. You sign.
I sign.
Is that that's a proper
Yep,
way of saying
the
it?
sign,
Okay.
yep.
And when we have a parent that might be deaf, and maybe the school, because a parent can write and can communicate via email with the school. If a parent is deaf, what do you recommend that they do to let their school know that maybe when there is an event that they would appreciate a ASL interpreter be at an event or be at a conference?
I would honestly, I would send them, I would send the same thing you send to any other parent. You know, we are having this event. If you need an interpreter, I would put that down for anyone. If you need an interpreter, and maybe even say including ASL,
Right.
because some people don't always include that. Let the front office staff know, and that way they can request an interpreter to be at that particular event.
Okay, because I would imagine that it's, I think we often take it for granted that, we think of only of foreign languages, but I think sometimes we don't include our deaf community, whether it be parents or grandparents or, or the students themselves. So I just want to make sure that we know that that is also a need in the community that we want to make sure that we're addressing. I think that is all I have for now. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm sure our viewers have learned something new, and if there are any questions or any resources in regards to interpretation that you would like to talk about, I would encourage you to email at interpreter@aacps.org. And until next time, this is your host, Karen McDonough. And normally I say something a little bit differently at the end of our show, but I found a really cool quote that I really like by William James, and it says, "Act as if what you do makes a difference, because it does." Thank you very much.